Welcome to session 2 on exploring coal transitions around the world. My name is Jessie Burton. I'm from the Energy Research Centre at UCT. We're going to try and make this as engaging as possible, so please, each presenter is going to talk a little bit, and then we're going to open the floor to questions and discussion and let them fight amongst themselves about the best way to transition away from coal globally. First up, we have Oliver Sartor. He's a senior researcher at IDDRI. His main areas of expertise are European climate and energy policy governance, coal transitions, and decarbonization for energy-intensive industries. But he is here to talk about the coal transitions project. He was the captain of that ship, and he'll present some of the insights of all of the work that we've been doing over the last few years.
Slides are actually in the order.
Okay, that's fine. We just revert back.
Okay.
That's okay. Yeah, I don't have any slides, so I can go anyway.
In that case, we're starting with Tara Caetano, who works at ICLEI. She's part of the Climate Change, Energy and Resilience workstream at ICLEI Africa, but she was previously at the Energy Research Centre with me, and she co-authored the South African Coal Transitions Report.
Great, thank you, Jessie. I also don't have slides, just because I didn't want everyone to have to die of a slide boredom, basically. As Jessie said, I worked with her on the coal transitions project in South Africa, especially. That's where we were based. And when we started the work, there was actually zero talk of any kind of transition, whether it be energy transition or coal transition. And this was only about 2 years ago, I think, year and a half, 2 years ago. And when we did our first round of interviews, talking to whether it be coal companies or national government, there was no thought of South Africa without any coal. So needless to say, there was no real planning going on for the transition at that level. Interestingly, the civil society was quite active already, thinking about potential energy transitions in the space. But our National Union for Mine Workers was one of also the first parties to come to the table and start thinking about a coal transition in South Africa. So South Africa is still heavily reliant on coal. About just over 90% of our electricity is generated from coal. And we're not only heavily invested in coal, but we're also continuing to heavily invest in fossil fuel infrastructure in South Africa, and that's mainly coal infrastructure, whether it be at the mining level all the way up to our coal-fired power plants. And we actually have 2 coal-fired power plants that are still under construction. And the completion date is around 2022. So that's just to give you a bit of a background of the energy sector, specifically the electricity sector in South Africa, because when we talk about a coal transition in South Africa and some of the scenario results that we got out of this modelling and also previous modelling, we're speaking specifically to the electricity sector, but also the liquid fuel sector, because we have a big coal to liquids plant in South Africa. So generally, when we think about the coal transition in South Africa, those are the 2 main sectors which we speak to. And when we start thinking about the coal transition, because of South Africa's huge development imperatives, you can't really think about the transition outside of development. So for us, it was mainly focusing on a just transition and what that actually meant for South Africa. And the start of our research, we were thinking about the challenges that were faced within South Africa, the challenges to transitioning away from coal, the vulnerable workers, but also communities around coal production in South Africa. And this is also a transition that's already happening within South Africa. The cost of supply of electricity has increased significantly over the last few years. Our electricity price has actually increased by 300% over the last few years, and that's in real terms. And this is because previously in South Africa, generating electricity out of coal was relatively cheap, but that's no longer the case. And there are also energy security risks when it comes to coal, because even though we have a lot of coal in the ground, it might not be perfectly matched to the plants that we have surrounding the coal mines. And there's also a struggle in terms of generating the finance that you require to invest in the major coal mines within South Africa. So we've been lacking both on the investment side, which has caused energy security risks, but also in the planning and logistics side. So understanding where we need to get the coal from and to generate electricity. Also going forward, huge risks in terms of export demand. So who are we going to continue to export our coal to? And so this is looking forward in terms of the coal transition, one of the huge risks that South Africa faces. And also just in terms of our demand. So our demand for electricity, specifically because of the increased price of electricity. This has also decreased the demand from consumers, whether it be households all the way up to industry. So low demand risks also impeding the use of coal going forward, and then also a huge risk facing the transition. So when we think about transitioning away from coal and thinking about the vulnerable workers, in South Africa, one of the other myths that we had debunked within this study is that the coal mine workers in South Africa are predominantly low skilled and wouldn't necessarily have any skills to take them further outside of the coal sector. And what we found is that actually employment in the coal sector in South Africa peaked in about the 80s, so around 1981. And the coal sector has become increasingly mechanized. And you find that a large proportion of the workers are either highly skilled or semi-skilled within the industry. So the idea of the vulnerable workers and where we move them to changed quite a bit throughout our research, where we thought we're actually not moving low-skilled workers from coal mining into other sectors, but semi-skilled and high-skilled workers into other sectors. So there were three scenarios that we looked at. One was the least cost scenario, where we looked at it's a scenario that was actually consistent with our NDC in South Africa. So we just looked at the most cost-effective way of producing electricity in South Africa and what that meant for coal. So we had just basically a phase down of existing coal infrastructure over the period. So yes, that actually gets us to our NDC, just the least cost scenario. But then we also went a bit further and looked into a 2-degree compatible scenario and what that would mean for South Africa in terms of employment, in terms of our coal infrastructure, etc. And then, as I mentioned, the sector that's significant in terms of coal use in South Africa is our coal to liquids, our liquid fuel sector, but more specifically coal to liquids. Okay, so I'm obviously running a bit over time, but let me just get up to our take-homes. So in terms of reaching our NDC or achieving our NDC, this is possible, and what we saw was in terms of employment was a decrease in employment by about 40% relative to our 2015 figure. This was because although coal demand decreased within our electricity sector, there was still potential to use coal within our industrial sector. So if this demand for coal doesn't materialize, then that also brings in more questions about the employment risks with the transition in South Africa. And our economic growth, we use a CGE model coupled with a bottom-up energy model, and our economic growth was still over about 3% per annum on average throughout the period. So this showed that by 2050, with the inclusion of about, I think it was 80% solar, PV, and wind generation, by 2050 that was generating our electricity, it was still possible to grow significantly as a country, but also to maintain some kind of employment, although the loss of 40% of our coal workforce was something that you needed to think about going forward in terms of your transition planning. And then just a little bit on the 2-degree scenario, which has accelerated the phase out of coal. What we saw there was quite a lot of economic stranding of coal infrastructure. As I mentioned, we have two power plants that are being built now and are only reaching completion in 2022, and neither of those plants are in existence by 2050 when you have a 2-degree compatible scenario. And a lot of the pressure that you put on the economy in terms of the reduction in economic growth comes from the misinvestment that you've created now by continually investing within fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's not even speaking to our planned investments into our coal IPPs. So 2 smaller coal-fired power plants that government is talking about. And yeah, so just thinking back in terms of what South Africa is just investing in something that could continue generating within our electricity sector versus continually investing or making misinvestments in coal infrastructure if we plan to achieve our targets in terms of the Paris Agreement. So I'm just going to go directly to the conclusion. Sorry. So we basically, in closing, it became very apparent that, and also looking from the international experiences, that there's this need to plan for the transition. And it's quite nice to say that over the period that we've been doing the research, things have developed, and to a point where Jesse actually attended a conference last week where there's now there's been an energy transitions forum that's been formed to try and deal with some of these issues, and that's exactly where we need to go, and just to keep on planning in terms of the transition and the potential impact on the workers within Mpumalanga, which is the coal region, and just to continue to understand the requirements in terms of which power plants will stay open until when will they close, which coal mines will that impact, which communities around those coal mines will that impact, and working together with communities as well as people on the ground and local governments in terms of planning for the transition. So I think that's just a very quick closing in terms of where we want to go with this research. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Tara. We're on to Pao-Yu. I'm sorry, I've messed it up. Who works at TU Berlin, where he leads the subgroup on the transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. His expertise is in analyzing the effects of decarbonization of the electricity sector with a focus on the future for coal. He holds a PhD in economics from TU Berlin and is a guest researcher at DIW Berlin and the managing editor of the Journal of Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. I just have to note that everybody here seems to be an economist today, which is really interesting, except for me.
Thank you very much, Jessie, for the introduction. So I'm very sorry, but I brought also some slides, but I'll try to speak freely and just try to use them as illustrative examples of some kind of main figures that I wanted to point out. Yeah. So basically, first of all, just a small advertisement campaign from the beginning onwards, because most of us have been working on this project, and you've seen already next to the coffee table, there's a stand with a lot of literature. I'm sure Oliver's going to talk about it as well, but there's a lot of reports. The things that I'll be talking about is Germany. So basically, there's a coal transition in Germany report that you can find over there, where most of the things have also been written down. And the things that I'm focusing on, it's not only what we're going to look at in the future for Germany, but mostly examining the historic part. So there's also a second report that is not lying out there, but that you can download, which is analyzing the historic analysis of Germany's coal phase-out, hard coal phase-out from 1950 until 2018. So this is basically what my talk now is going to focus on. So what I want to examine basically is what happened in the last 50 to 60 years in Germany, because actually if you look at the figures, a lot of things have changed already. And if you're looking at hard coal, particular mining procedures, we are actually examining a phase out in the next year. So basically in 2018, the last 2 coal mines are going to close, and then we have no hard coal mining anymore in Germany. We have to distinguish, there's still continuous lignite mining and etc., but hard coal mining we're going to finish. So therefore my case study actually examines 2 different regions. which is looking at different hard coal regions, but I don't want to go too much into detail because I don't want to bore you with statistical figures. It's just to point out there are different regions with different characteristics, and you have more questions, we can talk about this later on. But what I think is most important, the question is, why do we have a hard coal mining phase out in Germany? Is it because we are that much thinking about supply side policies? Not really. If you look at the price evolvement up on the right side, you can see two different kind of price curves over the last 60 years. The red price line is basically the price for hard coal mined in Germany. The bluish line is hard coal from the rest of the world if we import it in Germany. So mostly it's coming from South Africa, it's coming from Colombia, it's coming also from some other regions. So basically what you can see, most of us being economists, but even people not being economists, the question is, why should we use the coal from our own country if the coal from other countries is just cheaper? Why is the coal from other countries cheaper? Partly because it's easier to reach. We have very deep hard coal mining. On the other hand, also we have relatively high regulations with respect to environmental standards and safety standards. I'm not saying that the regulations in Germany were sufficient, but they're definitely higher than in some other countries. So therefore it is cheaper for companies, but at the same time you have to drill very deep, and therefore it's not cost efficient. The next question that might arise from your perspective is, okay, so this is 1950, this is 2018. Why have you guys kept on digging for the last 30, 40 years? Of course, at the beginning, there was always still the question, well, maybe things gonna change. There was an oil crisis, so there's a lot of different kind of also regional aspects to take into consideration. But at least in the last 20 to 30 years, it's relatively clear for everyone, being economist, not being economist, it doesn't really make sense economically speaking. So still, we kept continuing. And then the second thing is, so what happened? Did we actually switch from hard coal to renewables? Not totally. So basically what you see down on the right side, you see the red margin is basically the coal that is being mined in Germany. It's going down. And then the blue is imports. So basically there's a bit of imports, and in the last decades, it's more or less continuously usage of hard coal in Germany. It's just that we are shifting more to importing more from other countries. What you can also see is this line over here. This line is the line of employment. We had more than 500,000 people working in hard coal mining sector. These are only direct jobs. We're not counting indirect jobs, which will be additional. So we have more than 500,000 people, mostly actually in one region, working on this, and now it's like 10,000 left in hard coal mining only. Day to day, 2018, we have 2 hard coal mines, which are gonna be closed this year, so then the entire era is over. We're still gonna have hard coal power plants, so therefore, if we're examining this phase out, it's not about energy supply or anything, because power plants are still there. The business is still there for the operators because they still have their companies, they still have their power plants, they're just having shifted from local coal to imported coal. How much did it cost is the second question, because as I pointed out from an economic perspective, if people in the last years, you see this era, we still continued using local coal even though it was much more expensive. So therefore, of course, you have a lot of indirect subsidies by simply just making it cheaper to buy the coal, or by simply forcing other people to use the coal, or by just paying off employers that were not needed anymore. So therefore, it's difficult to put a number on it. We tried, we came up with, well, let's say around at least more than 300 billion direct and indirect subsidies for Germany being paid. I'm not saying that it was a bad idea to pay all of this money, but I'm just stating that looking at some other countries, it will be close to impossible to expect them to pay this huge amount of money. Looking at what happened in this, there's a lot of different kind of events, what happened, and you need to look back at the history of Germany, you need to look at European history, the European coal and steel community being founded in 1951. So basically the predecessor of the European Union being based on coal, the identity of coal. And now if you look at the EU today, there's a lot of things in there, but coal is not that such a big important element for the majority of its players anymore. For some countries such as Poland, but also partly for some German actors, it appears to be, but still the biggest era of hard coal mining in Europe has been faded, also due to what happened in the UK, what happened in Germany. And therefore it's very interesting, I think, to look at what has happened in the past, what worked and what didn't work. So therefore coming at the question, okay, so lessons learned, how do we enable such a just transition? The sad story is, I cannot tell you from analyzing these last 60 years that there's this one thing that you have to do in your countries and everything's gonna work out. Something that I can tell you is that Germany has tried numerous of things. If you talk to people, they will mostly not tell you this worked and this didn't work. They will sometimes tell you this and this probably didn't work, or this might have worked, but it's difficult to say whether it worked or not because we don't know what would have been the alternative. what we can say is we put a lot of money into a lot of different things. We can say that in some regions it worked a bit better than some others, but often also there was a lot of good luck linked to it. In the Saarland area, we had the advantage that the automotive industry was looking at different ways to invest money, and then they found a spot was very helpful. In some other areas, just didn't really work. We had a lot of money flowing into research facilities. There are a lot of new universities. There's the RWTH Aachen, some technical universities, a lot of new startups. There are certain areas investing more into environmental protection. There are areas looking at health issues, at chemical industry. So we have a lot of branch of dozens of ideas. So therefore, I think the important message from Germany is not, there's not one lesson. There's not one lesson, there's not one solution. But even for Germany, it was a bundle of things. People tried very differently. The interesting showcase of Germany is a federal country. So therefore, you have different federal regulations, which is a good and a bad thing. You have to try different things, but you can also try different things and see which communities did better than others. At the same time, you continuously have a kind of competition between the different regions. It appeared to be that the ones who tried to start a transition earlier, they got more funds and they managed kind of a transition, and they started to attract all the people and all the innovative ideas. While the ones jumping on last, basically we were left with a bit less funding, no new ideas. They tried to recreate what the others had done already, but then all the students or young people had already moved to the other scenes, and they were left behind kind of with some regions where no one wanted to continue living. And in Germany, it's still kind of okay-ish because there's a relatively good infrastructure, so people were still able to commute, and then we're still speaking at a very high standard. So the unemployment rose, but then fell again because German economy is booming in general, and we can afford this. And therefore, it was not such a big deal, but looking at other countries, things might be very different. So therefore, when we try to draw up this kind of like picture, it's just supposed to mean to you that it's probably going to be very complex. I'm not stating that everything, that this is like including everything. You might come up with 3 or 4 different other bubbles, or you might have additional arrows in there, counter effects whatsoever, but it just should highlight that you need to look at different things: workers and citizens, economy, infrastructure, education, soft location factors often being neglected. It's important not only to look at these economic indicators, but to look at political aspects, at social aspects, aspects of identification for the people. You need to integrate this into a total energy system. You need to think of the financial infrastructure of the democratic country of Germany that we had, which was an advantage of the governance of the social system. The advantage was that we only had to pay off people until the age of 60, because then afterwards there were pension funds. In countries where there's no pension funds, you have to think of different measures as well. There is an unemployment salary that is anyhow being paid, so you just need to put a certain pay additional on top about it. So therefore, for Germany, some things were much easier, but still we suffered a lot, and some people over there still think of the good old times and things always used to be better. And therefore, I think there's still a lot to be done, and therefore I want to close, and I want to close also with the last statement, which is not linked to the study, but which is linked to current situation, because just wanting to point out that we as Germany, we still have a lot of things to continue, and this is also linked to the future, and this is why I just want to highlight that continuously in the last 2 weeks, there's been massive demonstrations going on in Germany, not with respect to hard coal mining, but in the same federal region linked to lignite mining. There's the Hambacher Wald, which is trying to be evicted by the police and RWE. It's several people who have been living there in the forest trying to protect a 12,000-year-old forest. It's been 4,000 policemen who are trying to evict the forest for the last 2 weeks. There have been thousands of protests against it. At the same time, we have a coal commission which should come up with an idea, but they're still working on it. And so there's kind of a huge debate in Germany, and this is just why I think it's very important that we talk about supply-side policies, because this is about a mine which tries to destroy a forest, and people in the region, they're willing to fight to protect it, and therefore I think it's helpful that academia also thinks of different alternatives to advise policymakers to improve the current situation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pao-Yu. On to Oliver.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Jessie. So I have a challenge, which is that I don't just have one country to talk about. I have to talk about, well, 6 or more, because the Coal Transitions Project, for those of you that don't know it, was an international research project that started in 2016. And basically, at the time, one of our concerns was that, we'd started to have a bit of a discussion about, coal phase out in a small number of mainly OECD countries with relatively small amounts of coal, right? So this ultimately gave rise to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, right, that most of you would know of. where there's 36 countries now that have pledged to phase out coal by 2030, including France, the UK, Canada, several European countries, Denmark. But one of the criticisms of this initiative, although it's a very positive initiative, is that it only covers about 3% of global coal consumption, right? Now, I think that's somewhat dismissing its importance, because I think that some of the countries, in terms of concrete just transition policies and concrete pathways for phase out, will actually develop solutions that will be relevant for other actors that follow. So I think this is a positive initiative. However, our project was to say, well, hang on, let's look at the major coal consuming and producing economies. So we basically worked with leading researchers in China, in India, in two major exporters, so in Australia and South Africa. And in Europe, we looked at Poland and Germany as well. And basically, the task that each team was given was to say, okay, so we would like you to develop a pathway for the energy system that's consistent with the well below 2 degree transition goal of the Paris Agreement. So you have to describe concretely what are you going to replace coal with in the energy system, how are you going to do it, how are you going to make it economically feasible. But then secondly, to look at the other socio-economic and political economy aspects of the transition. So different teams focused a bit on different things, but essentially they looked at aspects of, how do you tackle the stranded assets problem? So how do you make sure that you don't get massive political resistance from companies because you're basically ending their assets well before their economic life? How do you tackle the worker transition problem? So the Polish team did a big look at this, and the German team as well looked at this. What do you do about regional economic diversification and resilience? What do you do about the governance? So how do you govern these kinds of transition policies? What kind of governance works or doesn't work? And then there was also another bit of work that accompanied this, which was we looked a little bit at past transitions, so industrial and coal transitions in Europe. And we also looked at the international coal trade. So there's an international dimension, obviously. So if China is roughly 50% of global coal demand, thermal coal, if China decides to have stronger coal transition policies, that has very big implications, obviously, for exporters. So we tried to model some of the possible impacts. Okay. Now, it would take me more than 5 to 7 minutes to explain all of the possible policy options and contextual issues that we came up with. But I just want to maybe outline 3 or 4 messages that for me came through very strongly in this project, okay? So the first is that actually coal transitions are already happening. So, the coal has actually, global demand for coal has fallen in 3 out of the last 4 years. It went up slightly last year due to some issues in China. But there's a good, globally it looks like the demand has stagnated. And the real question now is, well, we might go up a little bit, maybe we'll stay where we are, but we're probably likely to come towards some sort of secular decline in global coal demand by the 2020s at some point, okay? Why is this happening? Well, there's a bunch of different factors, right? So one is climate policy. So there's the 36 countries I was talking about. There's the fact that even China has put a cap on coal consumption. They're trying to replace something like 150 megatons of coal per year in their heating system. They're trying to phase out old inefficient steel and coal plants. But also, there's a bunch of other factors. So one is just technology, right? So in several countries now, onshore wind and solar, and perhaps soon offshore wind, are either equivalent or in some cases cheaper than coal plant, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that they're perfect alternatives, because you have constraints on these technologies as well. But what this means is that in countries where the cost of energy and the access to energy is a major problem, like India, that's a major advantage, right? So in India, for example, it's been estimated that 70% of the 200 million people without access to electricity could actually be provided electricity more cheaply through mini-grids and off-grid solutions than by building new coal plants, right? And that also actually works out that it suits some of the large electricity producers as well, because they don't have to invest in a large asset that's not going to earn its money back, right? So the argument that, we're building all these new coal plants for all these people that don't have access to electricity, that argument starts to go out the window. It also means that even in countries like Australia or South Africa, where you have aging assets, the companies will have to ask, well, what do I replace this asset with when it comes to do a major refurbishment in the next 10 to 15 years? And so our Australian team and also our South African team basically showed that, look, there's a very good argument now that it makes more sense to pursue renewables or other options, okay? So that's technology. And then the other issues, there's a bunch of other factors that are a bit context specific, but they're also really important. So one is just access to water. So in India, our Indian team showed that every year now we have tens of gigawatts of coal plant that have to be shut down at certain points because of water stress in specific regions. Okay? Now, you can try and solve this problem by sticking with coal by implementing dry cooling, but then that ends up being a much more expensive coal plant. Okay? Which reinforces then the argument I was making about the cost of technology. Okay? Then there's other things. So India also produces 300 million tonnes of ash every year they have to dispose of, which is not easy to dispose of. This has heavy metals. It's a major local pollution problem. You also have, of course, air quality that everyone knows about. In China, something like 90% of sulfur dioxide emissions come from coal plant, about 60% of nitrous oxide emissions. It is a major challenge for the regime because it's a major political and social issue. Okay, so, and then of course you have other factors. So just, in some of these big countries, there is massive overcapacity that's been built. So the average load factor of a coal plant in China is about 50 to 55%. Okay, so people talk about, oh, China's building all these new coal plants. Well, yeah, but they're not going to run at 100%, right? And in fact, some of them might not even be finally built because it doesn't make an economic sense. Similar story in India. 60% average load factor, but they seem to be, so there's a big debate now in India emerging about how many should they build, how much should they expand their domestic mining capacity. So there's a debate of sorts about coal transition, even though it's not necessarily about a decline of coal as such. So there's those factors, and then of course there's legal challenges, and in some countries as well. So that's coal transitions are happening, right? And this means that I think that we need to think differently about what the actual future for coal is. There's these IEA projections that show, well, demand will stay stable until 2040. You can actually really question that now, especially if these factors start to interact with one another. I think a second point that we show is that, look, despite these changes, we're still a long way from 2 degrees. That's obvious. But 2-degree compatible coal transitions are economically feasible. So in some countries, actually, because of these cost issues with technology, it could actually be cheaper, at least in the short to medium term, to pursue alternative technologies than coal. So on economic grounds, you can't argue anymore that it's not cheaper that it's more expensive to phase out coal. Secondly, we found energy security can be guaranteed, electricity access can be guaranteed under a 2-degree compatible scenario. One slightly more challenging area is stranded assets. Okay, so this is not so much about the cost of the system, but about the actors that have assets invested. Now, the interesting thing is here that in all of these countries, you basically have an age profile of assets. Okay, so it's how some of them are very new, some of them are very old. So the real question then is, and this gets back to supply side policy, is how do you manage the existing stock of assets in a way that avoids stranded assets? So one of the papers we did was looking at China and just basically examining a very simple rule. What happened if after 30 years of plant lifetime, you close the plant down? So the investors would actually be able to earn a reasonable return on the assets, but then you close it down. And what you do then is you limit overcapacity. You allow the remaining assets to earn a slightly higher return because prices rise a little bit and capacity factors go up. And it turns out that in a lot of these countries, you can actually strongly limit the degree of stranded assets if you have a sort of if you anticipate, basically, if you have a plan for coal phase down. Okay, so that's one of the options. There's also other options that we can explore as well, but I won't go into those. Sure. The third point I wanted to make then is on the social side, right? So we looked a lot at just transition issues. Again, well, first of all, I think it's important to define what you talk about by just transition. Just transition, as Pao-Yu said, is not just one formula for every single place. Really, I think ultimately what it's about is engaging seriously with the local actors that will be strongly affected, right? And working out what do they expect from the transition, and what can be done within the realm of the possible to meet those concerns. So I think it's actually it's about how we engage with people rather than a formula. That said, there are a lot of examples of things that have been done in the past or that can be done in the future that I think can meet a lot of those expectations, right? So, the international union movement has actually, been quite surprisingly put up a lot of suggestions that are some of which are actually quite, I think, sensible and interesting and reasonable, that are pro 2 degrees, pro coal transition, but that just make certain demands about how to do it. So there's an ability, I think, to start a discussion with those actors if governments are willing to do it. Okay. Then there's another aspect to this, which is sort of the citizens, right? So we talk about the workers, and there's lots of solutions for workers. For citizens in the local areas, it can be more complicated. Often this is if you have a region that loses 20 or 50% of its local economy, it's very, very challenging to reconstruct that overnight. It depends again on the region. Some regions are very isolated and they're not going to be able to reconstruct an alternative economy. Others are more dense and there's a lot of things that you can do. It depends on the skills and economic advantages of the local region. So it depends a lot on the cases. Again, though, what we find is that in a number of cases, there are things you can do. Europe has lots of examples of successful programs of smart specialization, related diversification, strengthening up other industries around the declining industry in order to provide a sort of a buffer for the economic decline of one sector. But ultimately, again, it's about engaging with actors about what future they expect and giving them a role in how they want to drive forward their future, right? Maybe the final point I would just say is what we actually find is that coal transitions are compatible with a lot of socioeconomic objectives. There's a lot of actors in a number of these countries, even Australia, where we sort of, Dennis was joking this morning about how, the craziness of Australian politics around coal. The irony is that in Australia, a lot of the people across the political spectrum also actually favour some kind of coal transition. So the major unions do. Some of the ports are talking about it seriously. BHP, a major miner, got out of coal. Rio Tinto favours some sort of carbon policy. AGL, the major coal, the company that owns the most coal plants, favours a transition policy. The Labor opposition favours a coal transition policy. It's just you have capture by one small set of basically the coal industry and some sort of shock jock commentators together with a part of the Conservative Party that's resisting. But the point we're trying to make in our report is that that's a relatively fragile situation, right? Especially for a major exporter. Okay, so I think that what one needs to look at is there's a lot of growing sort of willingness and consensus around the need for some sort of policy framework for these in lots of these countries, even the big coal consumers. The point is just to keep pushing that envelope and keep the discussion going so that once the political stars align, we can actually do what we want to do.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Oliver. Next up is Jan Steckel. He's the head of the working group on climate and development at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change. His research focuses on climate change mitigation in developing and newly industrializing countries. And you'll probably all be familiar. He co-led the chapter on phasing out coal for the UNEP emissions gap report in 2017.
Thank you, Jesse. Yeah, so this is actually not this is the right one. Okay, so I have chosen the most general topic of my talk I could think of. So the political economy of climate policy as theoretical framework. But actually, what we are doing, or what I would like to do, is to introduce you to some work that we are doing that I think continues very well where Oliver where your project, which I very much admire, I have to say, stopped. And this is basically the question of the political economy. So while you have painted a rather nice picture of coal transitions that are actually happening, I agree with everything you said. However, the other side of the coin is that in some of the countries that you have not mentioned, like countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, also Egypt, there is a coal transition going on in the other direction. So those countries are actually investing largely in coal, despite like all the discussions we are having. And the question is, of course, why is that? And as you have already mentioned, it cannot necessarily be explained by economic fundamentals, so prices, socioeconomics, etc. So there must be something else going on. And this is probably linked to the political economy of coal transitions, and we have thought a little bit how to get our hands on this. So why, you might ask, do we need a new framework on assessing the political economy? Arguably, there is a lot of work actually that tries to grasp the political economy of regulation and how to turn so-called Ozonian solutions where costs are very concentrated, but benefits are very dispersed, to more Steglerian settings where the opposite is the case, where costs are more dispersed and benefits are really visible. There is a huge literature on energy transitions, on policy sequencing, including science technology studies. And I'd say that those studies basically can be clustered along two lines. Like one is those studies that identify stabilizing factors for the current fossil fuel-based regime, so including political lobbying, powerful rent-seeking, etc. The other is more like on the side of renewable energy, how there can be mechanisms to promote them, so including niche development, etc. So why this is true, we thought this is not, we're not necessarily happy with those for the question, how could we actually understand why countries are still investing in coal? So we were actually looking for an overarching framework that we could use to go in those countries that are currently investing in coal and look what they are actually doing and find a way how to compare those. And the basic idea of this framework that we are proposing is not Oliver, but is that we is that actually policies will be implemented that best serve the interests of those actors that have the greatest influence on the design and implementation. So basically what we say is, in a country, there is a set of objectives available, and those objectives can be energy security, those objectives can be development, those objectives can also be climate change mitigation. Probably they are all somewhere in there in a society, and they are brought forward by specific societal actors, which again have an influence of the political actors that in the end are responsible for the policy. So, and how important those objectives are in the end in the policy formulation process depends on the context of a country. So, for example, is there an upcoming election? Is there a huge lobbying power of an existing fossil fuel industry base? Are there strong unions, etc., etc.? And we try to use these ideas that I could talk hours and hours about, but I think you get the basic ideas, and use them and go actually into several countries and do case studies that follow this framework. So we are currently aiming to establish a mid-sized sample of case studies, and we have started to work with Vietnam, Indonesia, and India. I'm going to present some of the results in a second. We are also preparing case studies in Turkey and South Africa. We also plan to go to Bangladesh, Pakistan, Philippines, Egypt, and others, and with the midterm goal to learn from those country experience and have a base how to synthesize the knowledge that we have gained. So just quickly, and I think already from comparing Vietnam and Indonesia, we can already learn quite a bit on where the major obstacles are that are in a way of phasing out coal, or said differently, in those countries that actually drive the phase in coal. So in Vietnam, basically, in terms of objectives, one very strong objective is, as one interview put it, is keeping the lights on. So the country is the Communist Party of Vietnam is very committed to provide cheap electricity supply, to maintain political stability and economic growth. But of course, there's also a huge share of this has to do with personal enrichment. Interestingly, quite prominent objective also is energy security. You have to know that all the coal-fired power plants in Vietnam that are currently planned, which are quite a bit, will be run on imported coal. Interestingly, most of this from Indonesia. Then there are a lot of state-owned enterprises in Vietnam that benefit a lot from coal use. There are some environmental NGOs that only have little influence. Interesting, there is some local resistance against plants, but this doesn't play a really important role in Vietnam. And in terms of the political actors, I think this is the most important part of it, is that here we really, when being in the country, we've seen a huge, let's say, I don't know how to put it in friendly words, so I put it bluntly. So it's a huge political mess in terms of corruption. There are a lot of people who actually benefit from coal. There is a revolving door between the regulating agency and the utility. People who are in charge of the regulation know that maybe 1 or 2 years from now, they will actually have the position of their opponent in the regulation. So this is quite interesting. As I'm running out of time, I will skip this on Indonesia, but go directly into the similarities and differences here. So in both countries, we have seen that there is a very high expected energy demand growth. There is a very high political ranking of development and infrastructure development goals, and those are connected to a possible power loss. So in Vietnam, the Communist Party really fears that if they do not manage to keeping the lights on, they will actually face some kind of a revolution. In Indonesia, the current president is very much bound to his promise to build infrastructure, and coal-fired power plants are a major part of this promise in terms of infrastructure development. There are very high investment risk for alternative forms like renewable energy. So the business sector in those countries told us that they are calculating with weighted average cost of capital of higher than 15%. And we did research that has nothing to do with this, but where we basically show in more modeling effort, if you have like WACCs that are that high, then investing in capital-intensive renewable energy doesn't make any sense economically. Then there's a very prominent role of state-owned enterprises and a very large vested interest in both of those countries. And the role of local governments is kind of prominent in both countries. In Indonesia, I haven't mentioned that before. So in Indonesia, the local governments profit a lot from coal and building coal mining, giving out coal licenses is basically proportional to the local revenues and the local budget. So what they do is basically giving out the licenses for digging even more coal. And this prominent budgetary role is basically also the main difference between those countries. So in Indonesia, coal is really important for the public budget, in total more than 5%, and the single largest source of revenues for the government, which is different in Vietnam, as Vietnam would have to import coal very soon. However, in Vietnam, there is a huge role of international investors. So Vietnam has just changed the status from being a low-income to a low-middle-income country. So this changed their attractivity, let's put it like this, for donors. On the other hand, international investors from China and Korea are very active in Vietnam, trying to sell their power plants in those countries. So I think basically this gives you an idea how this is supposed to work, but we try to make this with a larger part of countries. We try to, well, use this to really develop a toolkit to understand which policies can work. So how can we actually change, or where do we need to change the context? Where do we need to change the actors? Where do we need to change the outcomes? And in this, yeah, and basically really taking those political economy realities on the ground into account when we think of climate policies or supply policies. And we'd argue that this is very different from country to country, but will fail if you do not take those realities into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to open up to the floor for questions. Do people need to take a roving mic, or can they just talk? I think just talk. We'll do 3 at a time, I think. 1, 2. Well, we'll start with you guys. You can, and then John.
So I'm Megan Darby from Climate Home News. I wanted to ask a bit more about the social side, particularly because in COP24, the Katowice this December, just transition is one of the main themes for the Polish presidency, and they're planning to put out a political statement on it. So I just wanted to get a few more views on the kind of social side of the transition, and is there ever hope of a better future for these areas that are mining, where they've got these high-skilled jobs that are very tied to a specific industry, and just maybe just talk a bit about your experiences so far in South Africa. What did you find in these areas where they've already lost a lot of jobs through mechanisation since the industry's peak, and what's the kind of prognosis and feeling in those places, and anybody else who would like to comment?
We're just going to take 3 and then they can answer things. So just the lady over there.
So I'm just curious, you've spoken about some examples from the Global South. In Africa or in Asia, are there any in Latin America, even if it's not coal mining, maybe another kind of extractive industry? I'm curious if in your work you've come across any examples.
Yeah. I guess my question is particularly for Jan, but others might want to buy in as well. I mean, that's a very powerful set of factors you've outlined, which help explain the rise of coal production in those countries. 2 questions that flow from that, I guess. One is I would invite you to just say a little bit more about the highest priority strategies for addressing those. But in particular, my question is to what extent do you see those strategies being possible at a national level alone, or to what extent would it require transnational action by states, by non-state players to address them?
Okay, let's start with the first 3 and then we take another round. Social questions first.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So, is there any hope? And yes, we think so. So, initially, when one of the myths that we had debunked in this research project was that the coal miners were very unskilled and potentially immobile workers. So, the fact that they are actually quite skilled workers means that and there is some talk about it in South Africa. If it will come about, we're not sure. But if the renewable energy industry had to develop some kind of industry to manufacture some of the components required for the renewable energy builds in South Africa, that is potentially somewhere that the coal miners could go. One thing that we did find out through the interviews was that miners saw themselves as quite specific to the job that they had, and even switching between different kinds of mining was quite a big thing. So some of the actual coal diggers thought that they could only use one type of digger, and moving from coal mining to platinum mining was they required some kind of retraining. I think that's also an essential part of success in terms of the coal transition in South Africa, is factoring in the retraining into the day-to-day work of the coal mining sector within South Africa. So, what kind of training do you require for these workers to move elsewhere, whether it be into another sector, or elsewhere in South Africa, and whether or not these communities, these workers and their families would be okay with moving out of the region. So retraining is also something that needs planning within this transition.
Maybe I can just continue there. I think it depends very much on your narrative behind it, and therefore I would say that if there's an ongoing coal transition and there's going to be major distributional effects, so there's going to be quite some actors who are going to profit from it. However, there are also definitely going to be some losers. So therefore, if I'm going to the coal regions in Germany, I cannot promise them that after a just transition within 20 years, they're going to be better off. However, something that I can definitely say is that if they're not joining the transition, they will definitely be worse off. So therefore, not joining the just transition is just a worse alternative. So therefore, I think the major problems that we are facing in Germany, it's mega trends. It's nothing linked to coal, but it's just digitalization, it's democratization, it's urbanization, it's major trends, demographic change in these regions. So there's huge problems they're going to face. It's enormous. There are other regions which face the same problems, but still the spotlight is on the coal regions. So what they have to take it as an opportunity. They're going to get a lot of political support. They got enormous financial support in Germany. So they have a possibility to be better off in the end, maybe a bit less, but there's a possibility, and not doing anything will just be much more costly in the end for them.
Yeah, maybe I just add one thing. So I agree with what Pao-Yu says. That you've got to consider the baseline, right, for a lot of these places. Where they're not starting, in a rosy universe where everything's fine and then we come and destroy their employment necessarily. You talk about Germany, but Poland's a similar case, right? So the lignite mines in Poland look like they could be exhausted sometime in the mid-1930s. That's half of Polish coal production. Sorry, the 2030, excuse me. Yeah, I'm too optimistic, yeah. So that's something that you have to plan for, which brings me to the second point, which is, I think if you anticipate, you can do a lot on the social side. If you don't anticipate, it becomes suddenly very difficult, because when we looked at the past transitions, from the collapse of the Soviet Union, from the collapse of the sort of the situation in the UK, or other coal transitions in the past, once the economics kind of takes over and the companies are hemorrhaging money, and there's large numbers of employees that sort of need to sort of move out of the sector very quickly, it's very difficult to manage that in a way that sort of gets the best outcomes for people. But if you have time, then you can say, well, look, we've got 10 years. In 10 years' time, half of you will probably be at retirement anyway, because a lot of miners retire young. We can stop bringing in younger workers so we don't create new problems. For those workers that have the right profile, retraining might be an option. For those that don't have that profile, maybe we can have a transfer program where we can move you between sites as the company phases down. There's lots of solutions like that can be found if you anticipate. Yeah.
Maybe I can just add on this. I agree very much on what you said. However, you have to consider that this requires quite some institutional capacities. Sure. Of managing that well. It's already difficult in a country like Germany, and it is, I don't know, you can say much more about South Africa or like other developing and emerging economies. So I think it is a huge challenge. And one more aspect, you mentioned the aspect of time. It's quite interesting if you look into those model results, and there is not a lot of coal left in the optimal policy scenarios, how to achieve 2 degrees, or not to speak about 1.5 degrees in past 2030. So I think it is tremendously important to get this right. And I think this brings me to your question. How do we find international support? I think it's not only a question for developing and emerging economies, it's also a question for our economies. How can we build alliances? How can we actually think of smart policies. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, we do not hire new people, but it's another thing, how do you enforce this policy if you are basically faced with a very powerful industry? So, for example, like in Indonesia, telling them, okay, you do not hire any new people, and then like basically will phase out, etc. This is a tremendously challenging issue, and it's an excellent question. I hope that we get a little bit to the answers with this project. But honestly, I came back rather frustrated from the first two field experience. I mean, there is some hope, because I'd say that in terms of alternatives, there is quite some willingness of international investors to invest in those countries also with renewable energy, but they are currently holding back due to the regulation and due to the political uncertainties, which can of course be changed, and which might also be changed with the help of the international community. Think of de-risking instruments that can put forward internationally also from developed countries. But and I think this again connects to the just transition phase. I think if we put ourselves in the shoes of emerging and developing countries that have a tremendously high energy and electricity growth. So in Vietnam, it was higher than 10% over the last 12 years. So what do you tell them? Basically, you must not develop fossil fuel reserves as we have done in the past. So now see, please. So I think it's then we have like a different dimension of equity here, and it is, I think, very difficult to communicate this correctly. And on Latin America, I suggest you ask your neighbor in the row just before you, because she knows much more about that than I do. I mean, in Latin America generally, I'd say it's basically an issue of supply, not that much of demand, but maybe you guys know more about that.
Maybe I can jump a bit on this, because we've also been doing some work on Colombia, also together with Andrea, who's in there. So basically what I found most interesting when I was in Colombia last year was that Colombia is taking most of its electricity from hydro, but they are the fourth biggest exporter of coal in the world. They have one of the best coal reserves. It's most cheapest for many reasons. It's open cast, hard coal mining, huge seams. They're going to sell the coal as long as there's anybody out there buying it. Addressing them with some kind of climate issue is very difficult, and probably also not the right angle, because they are like, well, we don't emit anything, so it's not on us. And if even Australia is not bothering, why should Colombia bother? They have other problems. Approaching them, however, from a social and economic perspective, people started to listen to us. So basically we were talking to miners who found it very interesting that in 20 years there might be no one wanting to buy the coal anymore, so therefore there wouldn't be any jobs for them, there wouldn't be any more pension funds left for them, there wouldn't be any recultivation of the land, because there's very little regulation on these aspects. The financial ministry addressed us afterwards, and they were interested because they were afraid that there would be less income coming into the country. So therefore they haven't been that much aware of it. However, if you look at the economic indicators in the last years, the biggest importers of Colombian coal were the US and Europe. And US, for many reasons, is not going to import that many coal. Europe is turning away from coal, so they are now looking for other people to buy their coal. And there might be some countries, as Jan has pointed out, but things are a bit difficult out there at the moment. And this is the moment where I think it's possible to approach them, not from the climate, but the economic perspective, speak to them. There might be economic reasons out there. You would have no influence on them, and probably once the tide turns, no one is going to buy the coal anymore, probably from one day to the other, and the investors, which are international investors, will take away their resources and they'll just let everything behind from one day to the other. So it's good for the country to think of different alternatives, different industries to settle there, to think of legislation which to secure the renaturation, the recultivation of the land, to think of the people, think of the miners, think of the pension funds. It's of course much more difficult to talk with the people because the governmental structures, the institutions, the framing, everything is totally different and much more complicated. So therefore we have to be very cautious, and we have to, I think, support groups which are working in the regions, bottom-up support of academics, civil society, etc., being very cautious from an European Northern Hemisphere perspective, speaking about these regions. But I think it's very interesting, very challenging, but a lot of work is to be done.
Thanks. So I had one at the front here, then Matteo, then Kel, then Sheila, and then Alex, then Ron. You guys must all remember your orders. Okay?
Hello. Thank you, Simon Pirani, Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. I think it's a question for Pao-Yu. I mean, you've started to kind of come back on it, and it's following on from the question over here. Wouldn't one way of researching the issue you're researching be to compare Germany with the UK, where likewise a differential opened up between the price of domestic coal and imported coal from the 1970s, but there was the added element of political vindictiveness by the Conservative Party, which was determined to kind of revenge itself on mining communities because of disputes that had been between those sides in the past. And the other thing, which I think which I remember about our coal transition, is there was this kind of myth that what the dispute was about coal miners who wanted to carry on forever mining coal. And only somebody who's never been in a coal mine and never worked in a coal mine could possibly think such a thing. It's changing now with mechanisation in some of the rich countries, but you know, in the UK in the 1980s, as with most of the countries that have been mentioned, it's a dirty, dangerous job. And you know, communities had a much more sophisticated attitude to their future than they were ever given credit for.
Right, thanks. I also have a question for Pao, actually. I was wondering whether you see similarities in discussions about a hard coal phase out and what came with that politically and economically and socially speaking, and discussions about lignite today in Germany. That would be very interesting to see. And then also a question for Oliver on the Power and Cross Coal Alliance that you talked about earlier or at the beginning of your presentation. How do you see that developing then? Where do you see the significance then? As you said, if it's only 3% of coal consumption worldwide, how can a coalition or an alliance like that be effective? How can it weigh on policy making on an international level, but also domestically within these countries that are part of the alliance, but also countries that are outside the alliance? How can they pressure countries into joining them or considering coal phase-outs as well?
Sheila Whitley with the Overseas Development Institute. I think Olivia mentioned this very briefly, sorry, Oliver, about other transitions, but it would be great to know others on the panel and maybe a bit more from you, Oliver, what you've looked at in terms of other transitions beyond coal. So have you looked at transitions in other sectors historically, sort of looking at economic history, or it would be interesting to know if anyone's looked at that and what the implications have been for recommendations you're making, work that you're doing, and then also looking at current transitions. That's been mentioned, but I'm imagining there must be huge amounts of work happening in kind of digital transformation. You know, other sectors are having huge disruptions. I think the fossil fuel sector often gets politicized more than some of what's happening in these other sectors. So it would be good to know if you're looking at any of that and have research you can recommend from those other spaces or historically.
I'm Pierre Kühne with Lingo, the Lead in the Ground initiative. And the panel reminds me a little bit of a session I organized last year at the COP, at the coal COP in Germany, Germany's coal mining region, on future beyond coal. And we ended up speaking a lot about the present with a lot of coal, and we couldn't really see the way to get out of it. But I don't want to be an old man and still fighting coal. I think my goal is to stop runaway climate change, so we need to shut down coal much quicker than the modeling suggests and we can see. And often reality surprises us, you know, and suddenly things happen a way we didn't see before. So, and some of you might be familiar with the work of Tony Seba from California, who says that before 2030, fossil fuel electricity will be a thing of the past, and gasoline cars will be a thing of the past as well. So I would like to ask all of the panelists, what jokers does reality have in the sleeve that might surprise us? You know, thinking of real life politics, real life economics, that's very harsh sometimes and doesn't go according to our theories. What things, what initiatives, what dynamics could you see that speed this up so much?
We're going to come back to you guys. Let's take them. Okay. Go, panel.
You start?
I can try to give it a short round. Comparing Germany and the UK, that's a paper we have been working on for a year now. We're actually comparing it also to Poland, so we do 3 country analysis. I'm doing together with a colleague who's done most of the work, so I would refer you to her, Hannah Brauers, and she was supposed to speak in this session, but she was moved to session 4. So in session 4, she's talking about her Polish case study, but actually we're trying to compare them, and it's very interesting. We thought UK would be like the best case example compared to Germany with respect to coal. However, they switched to gas instead, so there's a lot of complication within that if you talk from it from fossil fuel perspective. So, but it's definitely interesting case studies. Comparing hard coal and lignite, it's very different, but same, you can try to learn things. The hard coal mining phase out was economically driven. The discussion on lignite mining at the moment, it's climate policy driven. So therefore, from an economic perspective, the mine operators could continue. So therefore, it's much harder to tackle them. It's much harder to convince certain groups of actors, and you need to take a lot of more money to kind of buy them out, maybe, or to think of options. The discussion is not only on social aspects, but it includes as well, therefore, energy security aspects, because you need to tackle the energy issue. So it becomes more complicated, and then people speak about energy security, and it's difficult to explain terms because you cannot prove it because it's not there yet. So then it's more difficult because business concepts of companies are really being threatened. Before, in the hard coal mining industry, you were taking away one share of them, the mining operation, but they still had the power plants, so they were still left with something. Now we are tackling the last parts remaining for some of these companies, so they're fighting against it. There's a lot of public pressure from different kind of angles, media attention, so it's difficult to have a deal in the back room, but there's a lot of attention, but that's good or bad, but it changes the scene. So therefore, there's a lot of things. And then last but not least, on these other aspects, which things can change things, I think innovative technologies. If we think of what renewables and batteries have done in the last 5 or 10 years, it's enormous because this energy security issue, even though people are questioning us, we have an answer on it. They don't believe it, but we have an answer. 5 years ago would have been more difficult, so we don't know what's going to happen. So the technical aspect, things is going to be coming easier and easier from day after day. The social aspects, the moral aspects, the fact that change is coming at a faster rate and people are not used to such a change. People are trying to distance themselves from these kind of trends. I think it's difficult to find a solution for this because it's not technical, it's people, and people are slow.
Maybe I can have a go at responding to a couple of questions. So one was on the Powering Past Coal Alliance and what should be the way forward for that? So indeed, it's a good question because I think there's a limit to how many countries are willing to commit, especially the large coal-consuming countries, to phase out coal by 2030, right? Also, I think they're focused it very much on just the coal and the energy system aspect, but to some extent have not marketed very much the social dimension, which I think is a negative in a way for their marketing in some of these countries we're talking about. That said, we're in touch with some of the people that are involved in this alliance, and I think they're aware of that. And one of the things they're trying to do is to now broaden the discussion beyond just commitment, so adding people to the list of countries that phase out, broadening it to a sort of a discussion about what are phase-out policies that people are implementing, what lessons can be learned across countries, which is a kind of soft way of coordinating, I think, across some of these countries with different challenges. And we in the Coal Transitions Project are trying to also facilitate some meetings to do that. So that's one way I think that they can try to move forward. There was a question on the wildcards. So I think a wildcard that is not... I think what people don't fully anticipate is there's a range of factors in play that could actually be self-reinforcing. So improving economics of certain technologies, damaging social and potent political issues like air and water quality or availability in some of these countries, and then climate policy. Because we shouldn't also forget that the Paris Agreement, you're meant to update your NDC every 5 years. And to the extent that countries see that there's a critical mass of other countries, even countries with significant amounts of coal like Germany or South Africa that are kind of having discussions now about coal transitions, that will put a certain amount of pressure also, I think. So there's a potential sort of feedback loop there that I think is important. There was a question down the back. I forgot your question. Could you please remind me of?
Other transitions, have you studied historically?
Yes. So as part of the coal transition project, we had an expert from Melbourne University actually talk about lessons from Europe's old industrial regions. So looked at sort of shipping, the forestry industry in Sweden, and a couple of other examples, and looked at the way European structural funds were used to address those and some of the policy solutions that were found. And that's quite an interesting paper. It's on our website. I can give you the details if you're interested. But yeah, I mean, it's some of the things that we say also in the Coal Transitions Project, which is that, it's often about trying to diversify the economy into related areas that build on the skills and economic advantages of the local region. But it depends a bit on the regions.
Can I just add something to that, Sheila? Yeah. I'm part of Coal Transitions, but I want to punt SEI quickly because they've been looking at this as it relates to other kinds of extractives. So Claudia and Aaron, I'm not sure as well, have looked a lot at mine closures and post-mining visions, which is kind of not the industrial part of fossil fuels, but the mining part of it, because there's a lot of similarities, of course, between coal and other extractives, especially around community unrest, like this increasingly emergent anti-mining struggles that happen kind of all over the place. So I'm just sticking my nose in there quickly.
Can I just have, sorry, go ahead. I just have a few comments. You mentioned the dispute between the mine workers, saying that all they can see themselves doing is mining coal. So one big problem that we also have in South Africa is that the coal mining companies are providing a lot of bursaries for students to go to university. So they're creating this culture of people wanting to be within the coal mining sector, not really because they honestly believe that it's the best thing that they can do, but more because it's the only way that they can get funding to attend university, which is continuing the cycle of building up the coal sector within South Africa. And that's also something that needs to be looked at, because if you're providing skills for young people to get into a market that's going to reach closure at some point, that's something that you need to reconsider. And then just in terms of what jokers we might have up our sleeves, so I'm an economist. I believe that the market will always provide the signals. Obviously that's a complete oversimplification, but one of the biggest signals that we've seen in South Africa was actually one of the big proponents of the coal IPP, so smaller coal-fired plants within South Africa, announcing that they were divesting away from investments in coal infrastructure, which so there's been an ongoing debate in South Africa from environmental firms versus our government about investing and committing to new coal-fired power plants. But this was the clearest signal from the market saying we're actually divesting from it. And then government questions why are they even trying to invest in something that actually has no investment potential in the market. So I hope that the market will provide clear signals. And also in South Africa at the moment, with renewable energy technology being at the point now, this is solar PV and wind specifically, where it's cheaper than actually producing electricity from coal-fired power plants. This has also come into course, and because of the regulations in place, government's actually stopping or impeding the growth of the renewable energy sector. But companies outside of government are trying to invest themselves to make sure that they're benefiting from the cheaper electricity. So unless the government reaches the point where the regulatory systems catch up, it actually leaves the local governments and municipalities in the state where they might find themselves not being able to earn anything from the sale of electricity anymore. So I think the market will stand up and speed things up.
As an economist, I of course have to agree, but I mean, I think it is very difficult as long as the market incentives are in a way not favoring a transition. And in this way, I agree. I mean, like, there are a lot of obvious things to get the prices right, etc., etc. But on the other hand, and this is why I get increasingly interested in this political economy issue, is basically who makes those incentives. It's in the end hidden deep down in politics, and they are again influenced by powerful interest groups. And therefore, I think, I mean, of course, we say, yeah, in our first best world, we just get the prices right and then the market will do it. But just getting this right, I think it's a tremendously difficult question. This brings me a little bit to Sheila's question. So we have been looked a little bit into tobacco and sugar, because I think the dynamics are not so different, so that you have like a huge lobby power, you have like the science is there, we knew for years and decades that actually smoking might be bad for us, but like they have been quite powerful to keeping regulations low and down, etc. So, and I'm like, we haven't really started with that yet, but I'd be interested in doing that. And on, actually, Kiara, I mean, I'd love to have your optimism, but still, I mean, I do see two things. I think, like, let me tell a quick anecdote from Vietnam. I think there people say that the electricity system is very much dependent on hydro at the moment, and with increasing climate change, basically the reservoirs might actually fall down and fall dry. If that happens, we have a huge blackout in the south of Vietnam, which might lead to a huge and immediate demand for renewable energy, because you can't provide it immediately by coal or by imports, because you can't put up the infrastructure as fast. So like those kinds of events, I think, might trigger, if you like, tipping points might trigger change. In terms of technology, I think it's technology at the one hand side, it's economics on the other hand side, because, and a lot of economics that is related to that. I mean, I agree, costs have come down, but still you need to think of various things. First off is the cost structure. So if you work in low income countries, then you basically have those high investment costs and high interest rates. On the other hand, it's the question, what can you handle? And it's not necessarily that, like, I mean, like we have often heard, we know coal, we know how it works, we know how to run a system based on coal. We are very skeptical on renewables. And we would also be dependent on technology that we do not control. So much more actually than in the terms of coal. So I think this is an aspect that might need to be considered. And yeah, that's it.
Thanks. We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to take these 2 questions that were here. How is it just Shivan and one more? Okay, 4. And we'll skip 5 minutes of lunch. Sorry, I really like Paul. Go, Alex, and then Ron.
Thanks very much. So the modeling that you've done is a 2 degrees Celsius compatible pathway. I'm wondering, is that Paris Agreement aligned, or is this like just 2 degrees we're hitting that? Because well below 2 degrees Celsius was, I think there were 2 modelings that was 2 degrees Celsius compatible. So given the real push under the Paris Agreement to be pushing beyond that to well below, are you modelling that too? Does that make significant differences? And if you're not modelling, why?
Maybe I can answer that one. Yeah, so, well, sorry, 2 degree compatible is my shorthand for below 2 degree pathways. We're not aiming for 2 degrees. But in practice, the way it's done is I mean, it's up to the country teams in a way to determine what they think their country's fair contribution is under 2 degrees. However, we give some sort of attractors to the countries, so to sort of guide the reflection. So if you look at past IPCC reports, you kind of have, for each sector of the economy, kind of a guide of roughly where the global average should be in terms of grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour of power and so on. And then the countries position themselves with regard to that. So it's not, you know, perfectly sort of targeted to 1.75 degrees, but it's the right ballpark, and we're trying to reflect the nature of the transition that needs to happen. It's not necessarily about trying to be very precise about degree targets. Yeah.
Ron Skidwick, OECD. I wondered if just a few comments and questions to Pao-Yu. On Germany, we started looking at Germany back in the late 1980s, at least I did. And I mean, if you look at, compared with other European countries, the transition out of hard coal in Germany is far slower than in other countries. And I'm just wondering if you looked at some of the why that was the case. I mean, for us, I mean, one of the things that I don't think you did mention was that my recollection is that they were still recruiting people into the coal mines into at least the 2000s. So in addition to all these very strict rules about we won't lay off anybody, nobody lose their job, et cetera, you know, they were recruiting, prolonging the situation. And the other thing is that I mean, I think it would be worth looking at some alternative models. I mean, if we want to have all these kinds of restrictions on, well, then we have to be prepared for things taking a long time. You look at Belgium by comparison, it's a smaller industry, but basically they have, once they got to where they realized, okay, there's no future for coal, they basically said, we have this much we can put into the mines to continue subsidizing them, or you can take the money and we'll close them down. And guess what they decided? I mean, the Kiel Institute itself, it might be worthwhile looking up this study back in the mid-1980s, said it would still be cheaper to pension off now every single hard coal miner than it would to keep subsidizing hard coal mining in Germany.
Should we collect money?
Collect them. Shivan and then Yonti.
This is Shivan Parkman from Stockholm Environment Institute. Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, panelists. This is sort of related to Alex's question. One of the most important points I found was a point that you stressed, Tara, about the difference between the NBC future and a 2-degree compliance future. The amount of stranded assets, the rate of unemployment, the general dislocation and transitional disruption. And given that the amount of disruption depends so much on the rate, and that a transition that happens in line with normal cycles of technological innovation or stock turnover or the lifespan of workers is very, very different from a transition that happens consistent with some exogenous climate science-based demand. Do you have any particular insights about a rapid, accelerated transition that is driven by a fairly stark exogenous demand like a carbon?
One more and then we'll take it.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to pick up on the question that you asked, try to ask maybe a more specific version. So accelerating change, or when things happen faster. In the period, say before 2011 or 2013, where coal stocks globally were still rising in their value, it was a very different era. People believed in growth. Since about then, right, stocks have gone down over 70%, and certainly it's growing in some areas, but overall globally. Have you seen what are the things that I think we've seen in the U.S. is the bankruptcies of a lot of coal companies. There's research showing their lobbying power diminished greatly when that happened, and there's sort of a feedback cycle or a death spiral where a lot of the divestment initially was just from coal because it's easy to kick them while they're down. Are you seeing any of that sort of, since that happened, any of those sort of dynamics in other countries?
Should I maybe start in Germany? It's more. So for the German case study, so definitely what we see in Germany, the political decision was to slow down the process. Prolongation was kind of the political target. As I showed to you the economic figures, there was no economic incentive behind any of this. So therefore paying off the workers and just giving them lots of money and just saying have a lot of fun and trying to create more innovative industries at the same time would have been much cheaper, and there were studies out there which showed that already at that point. However, as I said, it was a political decision to subsidize the industry and to keep it. Therefore, it was only in 2007 that finally there was a decision made that all the hard coal power plants are going to be closed until 2018. The decision for 2018 is simply also because due to European regulation from 2018 onwards, it's not allowed to subsidize them anymore. So therefore, Germany needed the European Union to come up with some kind of strict regulation. In 2007, there were still like 20,000 people officially working. It's not that these people were needed, but they were just being kept in their jobs and positions. So therefore, I think the German showcase is a perfect example for how not to do it in some certain way. It's a very cost-efficient, not a cost-inefficient way of paying people off, leaving not too innovative areas afterwards. And so therefore, other showcases in Belgium, but also, for example, in Netherlands, might be even better examples how it can be done in a shorter frame, and therefore also cheaper and more effective and more sustainable.
You want to talk on to?
Very good question. And that's something that we were been grappling with for about a year now, probably. So basically in South Africa, what we found and the way that we model the scenarios is that we place a carbon budget on our energy system and allow our energy model to optimize to reach the most cost-effective energy system for South Africa. And we have tried to model below 2 degrees, so try and define a 1.5 degree scenario. But what we're also finding out is in South Africa, as I mentioned, when you're thinking about a coal transition and decarbonization, you're thinking about the electricity sector and the liquid fuel sector, particularly coal to liquids. But when you are going for a more rapid energy transition, you have to start thinking about industrial sectors. And that's something that we know less about, and which is why we are also wanting to take that work further to really understand how much our industrial sectors can handle in terms of decarbonization and how rapidly we could transform the energy system through that. So I think when you're looking more into the rapid decarbonization for South Africa, the industrial sectors are where you need to focus, and unfortunately we just don't know enough at this point to comment on how rapidly they could decarbonize.
What time do you see?
I mean, we meant to go to lunch, but it's like 2 minutes. No one's asleep, so like, I figure like it's fine.
Because I can very quickly respond to the question about the timeline. So actually, I kind of disagree a little bit with the premise of the question, to be honest, because when we looked at past coal transitions, what we found often was very, very, very rapid declines in employment and output from the coal sector driven by market or technological forces. And actually, they often turned out to be faster, or at least as fast as the ones that we looked at in our 2 degree scenarios. Now, maybe we should be looking at 1.5 degrees and that would change things, but I actually think an opportunity is given to us by climate change in a way that it can be a chosen transition. And therefore, in principle, at least we can plan it and we can actually do it more smoothly. I would also mention we have a lot fewer workers often in several of these, not in China or India, but in a lot of these countries, a lot fewer workers today than we used to. If you look at Pao-Yu's graph, we're not talking about 600,000 German employees today, we're talking about 20 to 30,000. So I actually think it's a much more manageable proposition. In terms of the divestment... well, try to be optimistic. In terms of the divestment issue, I think it's an interesting point what you said about the US. I think it can be a bit of a double-edged sword. So in Europe, what we have is very aggressive renewables policies that have kind of put a lot of pressure on the coal sector in the power sector, and that's actually led in some ways to perverse outcomes because they then go and look for capacity markets and other kinds of out-of-market payments sometimes. So it's not always good necessarily to have them under pressure. I think well, it's good to have them under pressure, but it can lead to perverse outcomes. One of the challenges I also think is where you have large sort of incumbents, sometimes also to think about what's an exit strategy where they can also participate in the new market model. Maybe is something to think about as well. You want to encourage competition, but I think it's a question. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, everybody, and please, everybody, clap loudly because the panel is awesome.